Welcome to the Probability Podcast. Discussions on emerging and converging technologies, problems that are being solved, and the probability of positive and negative outcomes that we might expect. Now, please welcome your hosts, Jason, the generator Spracklin, and Patrick, the discriminator Lozon.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Season 3 of the Probability Podcast. The topic for our first episode is going to be an interesting one. We're going to talk about the relationship between governments and technology companies. Governments of many countries are getting increasingly involved in regulating tech companies, especially as it relates to AI development, social networks, and communication platforms. Conversely, many technology companies are getting increasingly involved in contributing to political campaigns and lobbying to influence legislation. As consumers, we are caught in the middle, with only our vote, both political and with our buying power, helping to decide the direction we want this relationship to take. So, Patrick, what do you think? Are we ready for President Musk or Secretary of State Zuckerberg?
Or the other way around, yeah.
We're heading in that direction, right?
We are, yeah. The idea of these, we'll call it collusion, right? These guys getting in bed with, the political parties. It's not new from a point of view of, big money getting into bed with government. But, there are some problems with this. And if you think about it, people interface with these platforms and these technologies every day, right? And that's what's different, right? Compared to, big oil or banking or whatever, what have you, right?
Well, yeah, they're part of the social fabric now, as it were, right?
Yeah.
Like there's always an impact in terms of, influence in our political process, but now it's kind of twofold, that it's not just around like the products we're buying or the services we're taking up, but also now it's about our, our public discourse and our communications. And even now, like the AI tools we're using for work purposes, for example, I think the difference here is that, and, granted, we're in a sort of interesting political times, as it were, right? But we actually took a stab at recording this a few weeks ago and ended up with some technical difficulties and had this sort of talk about things. And then since then, there's a new administration that's now taken power in the United States, and it's really painted a very interesting and sometimes terrifying picture of how big money influences politics. But in the past, we always knew it was there, but maybe it was sort of in the background, or we didn't, know what was going on exactly. And now it's completely in the open. So as people saw at the inauguration, you had basically, I think, every single tech giant, right? From Google to Meta to you name it, as far as, Jeff Bezos, and of course Musk was there. And you had, I think it was like 8 to 10 of them in the front row of the inauguration, combined worth of $11 trillion, I think was the number. And that's never been the case as far as like usually at a presidential inauguration, the front row is full of past presidents and, other people within, the government. But now it seemed like it was almost sending a message, right? It was this sort of message of solidarity, and we all knew they were contributing to political campaigns. And there you see, the 8 most powerful people in America in terms of wealth and controlling communication platforms and technology, standing up with the president, and it's, I think
standing up and applauding.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they want a total line. I mean, look what Zuckerberg did, right?
Yeah.
In a single day, he's dropping fact checking and loosening all restrictions and dropping diversity programs, this, that, and the other thing. All based on, our changes in the administration. And this alignment here is kind of scary as far as I'm concerned. The towing of the line, it really, from a point of view of what's the gain, right? What's the end game here? And that's what the scary part is. What we don't know, what's happening behind closed doors.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting because you look at that situation, and you might, like you said, look at it and go, well, they're kowtowing to the president. Now, if you listen to Zuckerberg talk, like I listened to his podcast with Joe Rogan, for example, I was just very interested to see what Zuckerberg had to say, and his sort of commentary was that, well, he felt like the culture in the country was changing, and the outcome of the election was based on the shift in culture, right, around cancel culture, and the different standards of what's offensive and what's not offensive, and this backlash against political correctness and whatnot. So his argument was that, like, the country's changing, so they're just changing their laws or their guidelines to align with that. But it is very suspect that it all changed, like, as soon as the administration. In fact, I think that, from what I read, it would normally take months within the company to have meetings and committees and review things to make changes.
Yeah.
And somehow all these changes were made within like a week or so or something.
Yeah.
Like, it all happened.
Those protocol.
Yeah, it happened much faster than it would normally happen, for example, right?
Yeah.
But
and the thing is, too, when you get into this, you start drilling down into this, right? The government's role typically has been that of a regulator, kind of the representation of the people, right?
Yeah,
representation and protection of liberties and privacy and security of the people. If you look at it from a higher view, you have a whole industry, and they're doing whatever the industry does to be profitable. And then you have, the regulative body, which is your government, and enforcing, bylaws and what have you to exact controls to ensure that the public or we'll say, other parties at this point, and those, could be representation of, the environment, for instance, right? It doesn't have a voice, right? But, the roles here they're topsy-turvy now.
yeah, absolutely. Well, it all started when you allowed big money into politics, right? There was a famous court case within, I think it was the Supreme Court of the U.S., that changed the way that money was funneled into politics. And that was sort of this tipping point, because it seemed like for a long time, and this may not have been completely true, but for the most part, people were beholden to the electorate, like politicians were, I mean, right? So politicians were basically, to get elected, they had to appeal to the people, right? And, pass laws and set policy that aligned with the electorate. But now, because basically, having huge sums of money is what helps you get elected, right? Because then you can kind of take over the airways with advertisements or propaganda, whatever you want to call it, and get elected, right? So now you have these, billionaires and trillionaires, or, contributing vast amounts of money. So these lawmakers and these politicians are bending to their will instead of the people's will. It's like George Carlin used to say, right? Like, if you want to see who has the real power in this country, I mean, he said this like 20 years ago or 30 years ago or however long ago it was. If you want to know who really has the power, follow the money. And I think now we've reached this kind of inflection point where it's even more true, right? If you look at, Elon Musk, for example, and initially there was this idea that he was going to form this committee that was going to advise government, right? And as soon as the election and as soon as the inauguration happened, all of a sudden they just said, no, he's actually running an actual government department now. He's got an office in the White House. He's got staff. He's got access to all these government systems and payment systems. And I mean, you basically have someone with like an obscene amount of wealth that has gained great power through the government, and he's unelected, right? And the people that are involved there are unelected as well, who are essentially involved there. So it's really a blurring of the lines. I don't think we've ever had an instance where, and not saying that other politicians of other parties haven't accepted money and backroom deals and all this other kind of stuff, but the idea that someone could come in and contribute, whatever it was, 250, 300, who knows how much money to a campaign, then all of a sudden now they have an office in the White House. You're basically, publicly buying your way into power, and you're not an elected official. And I don't think anybody really knows how much power he has right now. And that's what I find kind of troubling to an extent, right?
So we think about, the government's role in other countries, right? Other than the U.S. That model still is relatively intact, right? You've got big tech, basically doing what they do, but then you have the regulations around protection of, privacy, protection of minors, right? Ensuring that consumers are protected. The whole idea of managing, the infusion or the future infusion of deep fakes and, manufactured entities on by these, platforms and tools. And they're just churning out all these tools and all these capabilities, whether it be AI or not. And something has to keep them in check, right?
Mm-hmm.
Something has to draw a line somewhere and say, whoa, and this is where we typically look to our government to help protect, the rights of our people, right? And I think, if you look at Europe, you look at the Canada, and throughout, you've got some very interesting proposals, but they've got no teeth.
Yeah, yeah.
They don't have the manpower, they don't have the money, they have no teeth. What do they really mean? When you put these bylaws in place, these acts and what have you, you can't enforce them. So what do you do then? Regulatory or not, it doesn't really matter then. If you can't enforce, why put the regulation in place, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, we all want to live in a strong economy, right? And we want to prosper and have whatever piece of the pie we can get in terms of wealth. We want to see our country do well. But there seems to be this like overriding idea of like unrestrained capitalism, right? That
Yeah.
essentially we don't want, like, the tech companies in particular see the government regulation as inhibiting their growth, right? As like holding them back from what they can achieve. And also, like, there's a bit of an arms race in technology. Well, I shouldn't say a bit of an arms race. There's a pretty big arms race, especially
Huge.
when it comes to like AI, right? We have other countries like China and others racing towards, AGI or what have you, right? Trying to build the ultimate, AI technology, and there's some idea that whoever gets there first sort of wins, right? In other words, that not only will they build the best technology, but that can fuel, cybersecurity attacks and, war machines and everything else, right? That we think that there's some sort of end game with AI. And so what you're seeing is, from a financial point of view, you're seeing these, they're not paying any taxes, they're not being, withheld, they're not being regulated in any kind of way as far as like the impacts that they're going to have on jobs or other types of technologies that are going to disrupt things in the population. So like you said, like who's looking out for, the average person now? We all kind of line up and go and vote, but it seems like the people, like I said, like George Carlin said, the real people with the power are the people with the money. And now you combine that with the fact that not only do they have the money, but they have the technology that is now infiltrating our lives, especially with AI. And then couple that with the fact that they also now are controlling communication platforms, right? Where you have Elon buying Twitter, you have Zuckerberg, who, yes, started Facebook, but now is in AI and everything else. And you have this sort of perfect storm, right? Where you have people with all the money and all the technology controlling all of the communication and social platforms, and in some case, television stations or newspapers, right? Jeff Bezos owns like the Washington Times, for example, right? And there was some kerfuffle around his refusal to endorse a candidate, even though financially he was, backing the current administration. So I think it's almost like, and I don't know if this is the right term, but it's almost like a conflict of interest in the sense that you can really control that much technology and that much media and communication and also be in bed with government and contributing to political campaigns and influencing legislation. I mean, that really is the ultimate power when you think about it, right? When
Yeah,
you're
you're running the
controlling.
country from behind the scenes.
Yeah, exactly. And
Essentially,
that's what
what you're
people
doing.
are accusing like Musk of right now, right? For
Yeah,
example, the new cover of Time magazine has a picture of Musk sitting at the presidential desk.
Wizard. Yeah,
And I think
Wizard of Oz.
that's a pretty big like statement for a magazine like Time, right? And I don't think like some people might see that as like an attack on Musk, and maybe in some ways it might be, but I also think it's a pretty big statement that they want to put out there. It's a very striking visual to put a picture of somebody who's not the president at the desk and basically implying that they're the ones with the power, like you said, the little man behind the curtain in the Wizard of Oz. Now, I don't know if that necessarily applies here because we have some pretty strong-headed people running the government, but again, who's pulling the purse strings, right?
Well, it's definitely a battle, and I'm sure we aren't privy to a lot of that, and we'll never be uh, on any level of any government. But if we really think about it, there's definitely this conflict of interest is real, right? This is corruption, right? This is a form of no. They sell you something here called government saying it's going to it's going to protect you, it's going to ensure equality, and it's not going to favor any particular group, but it's all a lie, right? I mean, government is supposed to be representative, right? And it's not, and it's getting worse, right? And this is danger throughout all democracies, right? Doesn't matter if it's U.S., doesn't matter if it's Britain or Canada or anybody in Europe. Right? We've got to consider how we we build these institutions and how we support them and what kind of laws are there to basically operate them, and we got to destroy those loopholes. We got to fix the problems, right? And turn these organizations into what they're supposed to be. And if we can't do that, right, you're going to end up with mass corruption and individuals basically gaining off the backs of the poor, right? And that's what we see right now. That's what's going on, right?
Yeah, it's funny. You have basically, I mean, on the surface, right? You have a democracy in the sense that you have an election and everybody goes out and votes, right? But it's like, I guess I keep bringing it back to George Carlin, right? Even, 30, 40 years ago, whenever he was doing his big HBO specials, I remember him saying that, yeah, and you have basically you have the illusion of choice, right?
Yeah, it's an
That you have
illusion.
this illusion that you're going in and you're voting, but in fact, your will isn't being invoked, right? As far as like you're going in voting for something, but then the people who are in are doing whatever they want and they're kowtowing to the rich and the powerful and within the economy because those are the ones funding the campaigns. So it's kind of funny. A lot of what George talked about was true back then, and it's probably like 10 times that now. But he was pretty astute in that. I think he said um you can choose from 30 flavors of ice cream, but two political parties. He was talking about the
Yeah,
illusion of choice type thing, right?
yeah,
But I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, there still is, as long as we still have a legitimate democracy, there is power in the vote. I think it's interesting that a lot of what you're seeing is blatantly in the open now, right?
yeah.
Because we know
That's
there's
right.
always been sort of like I guess I already said that, but there's always been backdoor stuff going on, backroom stuff going on, but now it's just sort of very blatant, and it seems like in the political climate we're in that if it's your guy that's in office, then it's okay. It doesn't matter what he does because he's your guy, right? We become very tribal in that way. So where people in the past might have been more critical, now it seems like they're not. But the other side of things as well is like we talked about, you know, on the Facebook side, Zuckerberg, changing all the policies as soon as,
Yeah.
the new administration took hold. But the other thing that happened on the flip side was that all of the AI regulations that were brought in were repealed instantly. And then, we all know that if you look at, there was laws proposed in California and whatnot, and Elon was against all of it because, he's one of these guys that wants to win. I guess they all want to win, but he doesn't believe there should be, restrictions. Interestingly enough, he was one of the ones that warned against the idea, of AI taking over and destroying humanity. But then on the other side, he doesn't want the regulation because it's, holding, him back as like a company, for example, right?
Yeah.
So that's what you see, right? Is that, and if you look at it, interestingly enough, whether it's like the regulations on AI or any of the other things that happened around, moderating what truth is. And I mean, granted, even part of that Zuckerberg interview, he talked about how the previous administration really got directly involved in trying to get them to take things down off the network that they said were untrue, right? And in some cases they might have been, but in other cases they were just things that anything that went against the narrative of the government, they were being asked to take down, right? And, maybe some of it was foolishness, right? Because some of it was around alternate treatments for COVID that may or may not have been true, right? But the point is that the government really did get involved in that. And it wasn't just with that platform across the board. So I think what you saw actually, and this is what I think is the most interesting part, is I think, back, if we try to get back to the topic of today's podcast around, governments and tech companies, you saw the government start to get really involved in these tech companies, whether again it was like regulation or AI laws or free speech or fact checking or what have you. And I think these companies sort of said, well, you know what, we're going to go take our money and we're going to get these guys out of power that are meddling with us, right? And I think that was a big motivation. I mean, I think that really, I can tie that all the way back to the 8 people standing in the front row of the inauguration worth $11 trillion who essentially put their money behind the guy that has since shown that he wants to deregulate everything, right? And he wants unrestrained capitalism. So that's the other side of power, right? That they have enough collective influence in terms of money that they played a big hand in swinging the election, but it might have been because they didn't like what was happening previously. So now you have, again, the illusion of choice that you're going to be able to go out and vote, and yet you have 8 people with more power than the rest and more money than the rest of the country.
So one of the things too that governments do is, and part of protection is to ensure that other governments that are contrary or against the other governments, the other countries, under the premise of security, are protecting, we'll call industrial secrets, right? Technology secrets. And, it's laughable if you really think about it. The governments have put restrictions down on, imports and exports to certain countries and that kind of thing, but everything gets bypassed, and industrial espionage is alive and well, and it's unchecked, right? So if we think about whatever your opinion is on how bad AI can get, it's running unchecked across the borders, right?
Well,
If it's not going
absolutely,
to
yeah.
happen here, it's going to happen there, from a point of view of that sentience point of view. So it's also going to be technology that can be militarized, right? It's technology that can be turned into weapons. It's technology that can be used to defeat all encryption and all security measures, right? That's what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I think there was something recently. I don't know. I don't remember if it was OpenAI or one of these companies that I think it was OpenAI actually that changed their policy around the use of their technology in government for like military type purposes, right? They always had this like clause in their guideline around like we're going to develop all this technology, but we're not going to allow governments use it for warfare or military, and they changed that as well. Actually,
Huh.
very 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 recently. Oh, big
Oh, really?
surprise, you know. But to your point of trying to sort of legislate things to constrain other countries from getting ahead and that type of thing. I think what was most interesting to me, well, in a couple of ways, because it also touches on your thought about espionage. But if you look at DeepSeek, which is another big thing that kind of exploded since
Yeah,
we last talked,
very recent.
and what was interesting about DeepSeek in particular was that they developed this model that could run on a much lower powered, computer, for example, right? So instead of needing this giant farm of NVIDIA GPUs or whatever, that you could run it on like a home computer, I guess, right? And then be in control of your data and that type of thing. But the reason they ended up figuring out how to do that was through necessity because the US government had banned all export of NVIDIA's chips to China. So this company was forced to figure out how to make a model run on a much smaller chipset or a much lower powered chipset. So it kind of had the opposite. And in fact, what you've seen is DeepSeek essentially disrupt the whole AI industry. And so even trying to constrain it didn't work because like necessity is the mother of all invention. So it kind of forced them in a direction that they may not have even have taken hadn't they if they didn't restrict those chip exports, right? But here's the other side of the coin as well, that there's currently some sort of like lawsuit or government investigation that basically said that DeepSeek pilfered all this data from ChatGPT to build this model. So, I mean, it's on two sides, right? That it's like, they were forced into this necessity, but they also leveraged the technology that was built in the US to build this new model. Now the genie's out of the bottle. They can't go back and tell them to unbuild it. It's in another country, right? So it's interesting that those kind of two things in tandem happened. And now you have this massive disruption, which was probably going to happen eventually anyway. Eventually somebody was going to figure out how to run this on much less power. I mean, this end game of AI and football fields full of server farms or whatever is just not sustainable in the long run, right? But it's interesting how all that played out.
Well, yeah, I mean, DeepSeek is a good example of, a CCP sponsored development, right? And, from the material I've read, people are surprised because of the data biasing that's occurring with it. Why are you surprised? You think
Yeah.
about it, right? Of course, right? Of course, there's not going to be anything against the CCP within that database. I guarantee you, right? So that being said, right? Consider the source, right? If you're an individual and you want to utilize a tool and you want to put your money and attention toward that tool, then I think you should really think about who manufactured that tool and what they stand for. And if you want to sponsor that type of regime, go ahead and use it, right? If you don't, right? If you don't believe in that, then don't. And it's that simple, right? And bottom line is your technology is going to continue to evolve in China. It's going to evolve at a faster than light speed. There's some very, very intelligent people in China.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
this is a race that is a scary race, is what it is.
Unfortunately, I don't think people think about, sort of where the technology is coming from, like, and what the behind the scenes implications are. Case in point, this whole kerfuffle around TikTok in the US, you know, and TikTok is, it's made by a company that's essentially affiliated with the CCP, and it's like the number one social network, and people were up in arms when it was going to be banned and so on. And yet nobody seems to care what's being done with all that data and all that intel on people and how it might be used and manipulated, but even beyond that, how it might start pitting people against each other, right? Because social media is where a lot of people are fighting and
Yeah,
expressing contrary opinions, and like,
yeah.
that's where everybody's
Disinformation.
attention is, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So I mean, and then back to the whole topic of governments, there was this whole legislation, not just to ban it, but now to sort of say that it had to be purchased by like an American company, for example,
yeah,
um,
yeah,
which was interesting. And not only that, but then there was some sort of thing a few weeks ago around the idea that the new administration was going to create some sort of sovereignty fund, I think they called it, and that they were floating the idea that the government was going to buy TikTok. Now, isn't that a strange development, right?
yeah. So when we think about that, so this is a very important, precedence here. So we have an application that basically a user would install on their mobile phone and give all its permissions, right? And this application is affiliated with, we'll call it a hostile country, and that particular application is definitively under the influence, like the authors of the application are definitively under the influence of that government regime. And so there's no doubt, right, about possible alignments and possible issues of data privacy and so on, right? But take it to the next step is that, you have an application essentially on your phone that you've downloaded and installed and given all the rights to. You have a spy device on your
Yeah.
phone that, I mean, maybe there's a spy device on your phone normally, and you got to be careful about turning it off. But now this is a real spy device,
Well, you're given
right?
access to your microphone, to your camera, to your
Everything.
location, to your data,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
To,
So bottom line is that these are all monitoring points, right? And that maybe they're not going to monitor you, but they'll monitor, what, where you go and what you do and what, particular jobs you do. Right. So, you think of nothing, but, you go into a power plant and you work at the power plant, for a company or for, a particular role, maybe that's just administration, or maybe you're, switching on, turning systems on and off. Well, who knows, right? The bottom line is that this is a form of espionage at the next level, because the data that's being produced is at the quantities that is unmanageable by normal human beings, right? You can have tens of thousands of people, sorting this data out. You still would keep up. Enter AI,
yeah.
right? So now we have all these monitoring points, and we have, an AI brain just funneling all that data, and yeah, let's find what we need to find, you know. So in the end, if there's a problem, an interaction between the two countries, there won't be a problem very long.
Yeah, well, I think there's also manipulation of people too, right? I mean,
Yes.
that's sort of the bigger thing, that if you can't sort of take on another country head on, then if you can try and divide its people or get people to think differently about things,
Yeah.
right? You can influence elections, you can influence behaviors, you can influence all kinds of other trends and buying habits and all kinds of things, right? So it's kind of becomes that sort of like enemy from within, but then you can also manipulate information, and that's really the other side of it. Like we're signing up, we're giving our information, but the other side of it is that these platforms become information platforms in a sense, right? And what you've seen in the last, especially in the last 5 years, is largely like a dissolving of traditional media, or at least the confidence or respect for actual like news organizations, right? This
Yeah.
vilification of the media, the mainstream media. I don't trust this network and that network or whatever have you. In fact, there was some like terrifying statistic of how some large percentage of adults that get their news from TikTok or other
Yeah.
things. But in particular, it was like
What a joke.
people say like, I get all my news from TikTok. Well, who's controlling that narrative, and how many bots and AI agents or whatever in there posting content that are manipulating people, and all the algorithms are set up to feed you like more and more of it. And, back to your comment about DeepSeek, I saw something on LinkedIn, I think it was actually, where it showed somebody asking DeepSeek about what are the human rights atrocities perpetrated by the CCP government. And it said basically, I don't know what you're talking about. That doesn't happen. Like, they've never violated any human rights. And then you basically rephrase the question and you just replace, China with U.S. and it gives you a whole list of things that the U.S. did in Guantanamo Bay. So it's like, it's blatantly just, just eliminating certain information or pretending it doesn't know. And so it's like, okay, that's like a DeepSeek example of you asking a particular question, but how much of that could be done sort of at scale, within a platform. So it's kind of interesting that, and that kind of leads to, the other idea of, government's involvement in tech and information. And, you mentioned earlier, like Zuckerberg getting rid of fact checking, for example. And, in favor of community notes, right? Where the community gets to decide what's true and what's not, right?
The mob will decide, right?
But you think about that, like I was, the reason why I was going in that direction is, if you think about it, right? If you have social platforms, which now are no longer really moderated by like an independent fact checker or a number of different fact checkers, and you're saying, well, the community is going to decide. Well, what happens when the community gets manipulated into believing certain things are true, or certain beliefs are toxic, or whatever it is, right? And now all of a sudden, now you've influenced everybody on the platform to think a certain way about a certain thing. Now you can go and post a whole bunch of stuff, and the community's not going to fact check it because they now believe it's all true. And you thought we were living in a post-truth world, a year ago. I think we're rapidly declining, as far as, if we're not going to have any kind of like fact-checking regulation. They lifted all the guidelines around political content. It's just these platforms become these like huge kind of propaganda machines in a sense, right? And it's the primary way people get information, for sure. Like, everybody I talk to, and they're getting it from some sort of social platform, and oftentimes you don't know what the sources of those articles actually are, right? That's the sort of challenge, right?
Nobody does their due diligence to really check, right? And the people who used to do that, they don't work anymore. They've changed careers because they can't get a paycheck.
Oh,
right?
Yeah, for sure.
And here's the scary thing too, like, as a individual, let's say you are slighted by a big corporation, or you have something that, somebody ripped you off or whatever. Who do you report to? Who's gonna be on your side? Are you gonna see that journalist? You're gonna be able to reach out to an independent representation of the truth and have them, expose, what's going on? No, right? There's a fundamental broken system that underlying everything right now, and it can't continue to function this way. People are going to get harmed, right? So, I think personally that we're losing sight of system controls, right? If you have a system, in order to have that system run well, you have to have controls on it. And those are feedback controls. Those controls will, in effect, when things start to go out of spec or out of limit, they get corrected, right? And that keeps the system in balance, right? When a system has no self-checking capabilities, it goes out of balance. It goes out of control, right? It can no longer be trusted. And that's where we're headed, right? That's where we're going to see systems that are going to be basically, they're going to be taken as gospel for one group and completely ignored by another, right? It's just going to lead to conflict. right? And ultimately, we're going to have to swing back on that pendulum because that's that's chaos over here where we're, we're
Yeah.
headed,
I
right?
mean, you look at the idea of bias. We covered that in the first season, right? And that, kind of this ties into the topic today as well of sort of the tech influence in politics, but the fact that they're controlling these social platforms, communication platforms, information platforms, but you see in many cases a direct lineage to like a political ideology, right? So we're very much these days caught up in this like left versus right ideology, and now we're going to see that reflect in these sort of microcosms of where people interact online, right? If you go on Twitter, back in the day when it was
Yeah,
run by, let's just say, like more progressive people in terms of that ideology, whether you want to call it left or right, there was just certain atmosphere there, right, of what thing people talked about. And from everything I've read, I stopped using the platform a long time ago, just not because of any, political thing, but just because I just wasn't getting the value out of it I wanted to. But from everything I've heard, it's become this really sort of toxic place where it's overrun by like a extreme far right sort of conglomerate of people, and that on top of that they've removed the fact checking, and who knows what's going on with AI on the platform. And so now it's very much become this sort of like place, for people of a certain ideology, and so they're going to be continuously reinforced in that ecosystem, right? And then you have other places that, like Facebook, maybe was more aligned with progressive ideologies, I guess, or more left leaning, liberal type things. Who knows where it's headed now, right, with this switch? But the point I'm trying to get to, though, is that whether it's a social platform or like an AI tool or whatever else, like we're getting to a place where there's like a stark bias, and it all kind of filters back to like the people running it and how they're affiliated politically. So it just seems like everything's just getting like more and more entangled, right? And it's like there would be nowhere sort of neutral to go and have like a debate or a discussion about things, because I mean, that almost doesn't exist right now, right? That
yeah,
mostly what you have is a bunch of people like screaming at each other online. I mean, I every now and again I'll go into something that's posted that's maybe a little bit political in nature, and there's no like intelligent discourse, right? There's nobody like me and you trying to like dissect something and look at it objectively. There's a bunch of people on one side screaming at a bunch of people on the other side because
chaos.
they've been sort of fed this idea, and it just keeps getting reinforced. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that here's this like perfect storm of like the people who are running the social platforms and the communication platforms now publicly aligning themselves with a certain political ideology, and it's like there's nowhere for anybody to get any refuge from it anymore.
Yeah. So, stay tuned for our next episode where we talk about AI agents. So we're going to see all these platforms being polluted by, developers on AI agents. And then after a little while, when the AI overlords take over, everybody, who thinks they have control is going to realize there is no control.
Yeah.
Control is, it was an idea a long time ago, and they're on their way to losing it, is what's happening, especially at the rate they're going. So that all being said, let's talk about, feedback systems and system checks and regulations. I mean, those are all ideas that, if implemented properly and you have transparency, it all builds trust, right?
Yeah,
You
yeah.
trust the systems that are working, right? And to me, I mean, I like to think, that, your local neighborhood nuclear reactor is, utilizing a software system that you can trust and not being, updated every week and, you know, being modified for nefarious or silly reasons, right? and this is the reality: is that critical software systems are going to be infected by you know we'll call lack of proper control. right? And those are going to lead to harm, right? And what's going to happen is everybody's just going to point to everybody else and blame everybody else,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
nobody is going to be held, you know, accountable, right? And that's kind of what, I see this, not only in, you can see this too in the from a point of view of systems that are being utilized for voting, right? They
Hmm.
have to be fully transparent, right? You have to be able to um, completely verify, any specific vote or group of votes, whatever, what have you, those numbers, right? And when you cannot do that, when there's doubt, then the whole system is then you can't, you have to throw it out the window. It's no good, right? And we're getting into the point where these systems, these social platforms, these control systems that are critical to paying people, you know, to managing the safety of people, to even maintaining democracy, are going to be corrupted, right? By, players that are just looking at the profit, right? Instead of regulation. This is we're heading into a very difficult time here. That's what I think, anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we always kind of end up coming back to, talking about, things, back in the day, as it were, right?
Yeah,
Back in our day kind of thing. But when you do think about, it almost seems impossible to think about that we lived at a time without the internet, but we certainly did. And, it
yes, we
was,
did.
we lived through it,
And
and we
phones.
all, we communicated in sort of other ways, but more, publicly, right? That a lot of the, discourse was face to face with people, right? In bars or at other social type activities, right? And it was, you kind of knew who you were dealing with. There was none of this anonymity that comes with being on the internet. And it was sort of, before that, it was, you had sort of trusted sources for things, and you could decide, well, I don't believe in, whatever the, the president or the government's saying, but and certainly I'm sure there was money behind a lot of these networks and whatnot. But from what I remember, I don't know what your recollection is, but it seemed like we had a lot of trust in these sort of independent news organizations. That if you sat down at night and watched the nightly news with Dan Rather, right, or you watched the National on CBC, that it was pretty unbiased reporting for the most part, and you pretty much could count on what was being, reported was, you know, largely without bias and had some level of integrity and the journalism behind it and that type of thing. And that as soon as we opened up the internet and smartphones and social media, it just sort of became the Wild West. And now we're at a point where people don't know who to believe, what to believe, and with AI, they don't even know if they can believe what's in front of their eyes. And so, if you look at the power of the tools that these tech companies are creating now to create, people and scenes and audio and video and voice and everything out of thin air, right? That we're really entering like a new era of not just, sort of not knowing what to trust or what's real, but having the puppet masters controlling the ability to really, kind of dupe the population into believing certain things. There was, even in this recent election, there were things that went around that people were believing were true, which was complete AI fabrications and just general misinformation and stuff happening, right? So I guess, I don't know where I'm going with that other than to say that I absolutely love technology and I've loved seeing it growing over the years. But the fact that we put very little regulations around it, especially in the last little bit, means that we're just sailing off into uncharted territories, and it's going to be, I guess, both interesting and terrifying to see where it goes.
Yeah,
Right? It's
yeah,
it's amazing how much has changed in the last 10 years. I think there's a lot of good that can come out of it, but I'm not sure I'm convinced that we're sort of leaning in the good direction these days, as it
yeah,
were.
yeah. I agree with you. And bottom line is, you get uncontrolled systems will go out of control, right? and you will have chaos, right? And that's just the rule of nature. So, if you want to counter that, then it takes work and time and money and structure. Without any of that, right? Then you have basically you got to step back and say, what's the value? Why even interface with that? Why even utilize that tool? Why even consider that, that piece of software, for instance? That's where, the human being has to step back and say, am I better off? Or
Yeah.
is my life, being made miserable by this technology, right? And I'll go back to your conversation you're talking about. You were leading into, for instance, bullying, right? There was one thing bullying back when we were kids, but I think I read a story just recently about, an individual who had, in high school had made a bunch of fake, we'll call them pornographic representations of different schoolmates, right? That's, you don't think about that as, oh, well, that's just, well, it's fun and games. Well, no, that was, traumatic for the people who were on the other end of this, right? Um, th- this is where we're going, is that, without regulations and controls, especially on generation of AI video content that isn't somehow verified. There's no way of verifying it. Um, it's the Wild West, right? We need to have regulations. We need to have controls. We need to ensure that we're protecting, the parties that need protection, right? And anybody that wants to run unregulated, right? All they have to do is look at the insurance industry, and it's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. And the insurance industry has considerable regulation. Now, if they were doing such a bloody good job, they wouldn't need any regulation at all. But a system needs to have controls. And that is just the nature of things. So we'll see what happens in the end, right?
Yeah, I think the challenge is that the genie's out of the bottle, as I think I already said today. And as the old expression goes, I don't think you can put the genie back in the bottle, right? And I think that we've already crossed that threshold, right?
Yeah.
Of, the tech billionaires having too much money, which just translates to too much power, too much influence, not just over the politicians, but over the population, right? And, I guess you might call them like Silicon Cowboys.
In a world of screens and endless streams, the cowboys ride on digital beams. They herd our thoughts with clicks and taps, while governments lay out their traps. Politicians with their laws to draft, the locking paths with bureaucratic craft. Tech giants hold the keys so tight in this wild west of dark and light. Where the wires meet the law, who's to win and who's to fall. Kings and shadows, truth unfolds, unelected, shifting gold. In the valleys of their silicon hills, echoes of our freedom with their skills. Censorship or guidance, what's their game? Regulations cloak hangs in vain. Riding free or held on reins, just a pawn on these electric planes. Whispers loud from megaphone, who's in charge when kings enthrone? Where the wires meet the law, who's to win and who's to fall. Kings in shadows, truth unfolds, unelected, shifting gold. Meet the law, Who's to win and who's to fall? Kings in shadows, truth unfolds. Unelected, shifting goals. When the wires meet the law, who's to win and who's to fall? Kings in shadows, truth unfolds. Unelected, shifting goals. Unelected, shifting
Hoo-ha!
Yeehaw!
Thank you for listening to the Probability Podcast. Please join us next time for more musings from the generator and the discriminator.